My name is Courtney Yerger, and today I'll be talking with you guys about the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. Now, this act was a crucial part of aviation history, especially for the airlines. Without this act coming into place, the airline industry would look nowhere near like what it looks today. This act gave the airlines the opportunity and the freedom to really just expand their routes, expand the industry, and honestly gain some healthy competition just in the economic market as a whole. So today we'll be talking about what the airline industry looked like prior to the act coming about, what people and things caused this need for change in the airline industry, what the goals of the act were, some of the after effects of the act, and along with that, what this specifically looked like for the regional jet industry. So we'll get right into it today with what it looked like prior to deregulation. So prior to deregulation, the government very much so had its hands in the airline industry through what they called the CAB. This was the Civil Aeronautics Board. It was formed in 1938 and pretty much owned the domain of all domestic interstate transportation. Most intrastate, so within the state transportation, was still up to that state's government. So this was mostly from state to state. A lot of the regulations that they had included the fares, the schedules, and the routes that these airline industries would take. So to get any changes in those routes or any additions to change their fares, any of that stuff needed to go through the CAB prior to being enacted. Now the problem with this was that the CAB, being a government industry or a government body, was a pretty slow moving piece of machinery. So unfortunately, it was very difficult for anything to come about quickly for these airline companies. So sometimes they would put in these requests for changes in fares or routes, and it would take months for them to hear anything back, if not years. So it was very difficult for there to be any change to the airline industry, and it very much so affected the efficiency and the growth and effectiveness of the airlines. So after this point, Alfred E. Kahn was actually the one that brought about the largest amount of change that they wanted. So in about 1970 to 71, during the Nixon administration, legislation was proposed to start diminishing prices for the railroad and transportation trucking industry. Now, this was something that, it being transportation, did not entirely relate to aviation, but still had some correlation with that. This actually led to the thoughts of the airline transportation industry as well. So after this point in 1977, President Jimmy Carter then elected Alfred E. Kahn to become the chair of the CAB. He was a professor of economics at Cornell University and had some big ideas for what he wanted to see happen in the airline industry. He was really looking to break up the industry structure, to break up the government's say in that, and to also start creating room for new airlines, increasing competition, and begin lowering fares, not only for the people and allowing there to be more room for that, but then allowing for more airlines to come in as well. So once the act was passed in 1978, the CAB lost a lot of its sway in the airline industry and eventually would be phased out in 1985. So some of the goals of the act was to maintain the safety of the airline industry. This was actually one of the highest priorities in the air commerce industry at this point. There had been some accidents and continue obviously to be accidents today, but using the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, and the FAA, the Federal Administration or Aviation Administration, a lot of these safety concerns as they've come up have been quickly looked at, regarded, and then brought about changes to make sure that those things won't happen again. So that has been very important, especially in the aviation industry. Along with that, they look to be placing maximum reliance on competition in providing lower fares for air transportation. So this encouragement of expanding this industry has allowed for a lot of growth. Prior to this point, there weren't, I think it was about 40 to 50% of the seats on an airline would be taken up. So they weren't truly utilizing their resources well, and it was mostly due to the high fares and the lack of locations that they had throughout the US. It was mostly at like big cities, and at this point they were very point-to-point airlines. So along with that, the avoidance of unreasonable industry concentration would tend to allow one or more air carriers to then unreasonably increase prices. So having these different airlines come up and join in and allowing them to then take their fares, this had this healthy competition that allowed the fares to stay low and much lower than they had been in the past. So and along with that, the encouragement of entry into the air transportation market by new air carriers and entry into additional markets by existing air carriers, and the continued strengthening of small air carriers. Now that is mostly what we're going to be focusing on today, is having these small air carriers in as well, and that's mostly what the regional jets were. So some of the effects of this act. So the average fare per passenger actually lowered about 9% between 1979 and 1994, and has continued to lower even today. They have created some airlines that are very focused on cost efficiency over conveniency. So you won't have to pay a lot for the ticket, but then you don't get extra things like snacks or baggage and that kind of stuff, so you'll have to pay extra for those. But it's caused these tickets to go down in price. Along with that, the number of passengers has more than tripled from 207.5 million up to 721 million passengers in 2011. So, so in 1974, they only had about 2 million people, and now it has gone up to about 700 million people a year engaging in airline transportation. Along with that, this has changed a lot from, like I said earlier, that point-to-point system of just going from one airport to another and back again, to this hub and spoke system that has created the airlines into what they are today. So a lot of airlines, especially in places like Atlanta, in Chicago, in Texas, places like that, have created these hubs that flights will go into smaller cities and then fly to those big hubs where they will connect with bigger aircraft and then travel to other places as well. So that has caused the airline industry to become much more effective and much more efficient in the past several years. Along with that, at this time, 8 major air carriers, which at the time were Eastern, Midway, Braniff, Pan Am, Continental, Northwest Airlines, and TWA, actually liquidated, and over 100 smaller airlines were also bankrupt between 1978 and 2001. So at first, this may look like a bad thing, but however, this allowed for increase in other airlines. This allowed for smaller regional jets to even take over, and that allowed for a lot of connections to be made between these regional jets and these larger industries. So at the same time, like I say in the last point here, that a lot of these airline companies closing down was unfortunate, but allowed for new growth in the industry. So last but not least, what did this do for the regional industry? So for a long time, many flight routes were protected by the cabs, so they were only given out to certain people. And those fares, like I said, were skyrocketing, so it caused there to be a bit of a crinkle with the amount of passengers they were getting. It was not being efficient. So from that, now that the cab is gone, with deregulation, new airlines were able to begin routes wherever, and they were not limited on the kind of airplanes they could fly. So they were allowed to use smaller aircraft to transport. So for example, in Lynchburg, Virginia, where I am right now, they were able to use smaller aircraft to transport to Charlotte, where they then do that kind of spoke hub thing, that they will transport them over to a bigger airline, and where they will then go somewhere else even bigger. So this allowed for a lot of these mergers, which I say later, the pseudo branding, of these airlines to increase across the board. So like I said, there are like PSA and American Airlines, and a lot of these smaller regional jets are now connected to bigger ones like Delta, United, and so forth. So this allows for smaller routes to happen with smaller planes, again, making it more efficient. This dropped fares and allowed for much more efficient flights, again, and it kind of combined the idea of the hub-the-spoke and the point-to-point system. So overall, I think having the deregulation of the airline industry was crucial to its growth now and for allowing the regional airlines to really thrive in this time. Thank you for your time, and here are my references. It's been a pleasure.